world of Englishes and English as a lingua franca. It's a reality, actually, right?
Exactly. It's the best topic because we're living it every single day. So bring it on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We get to experience, right, firsthand, because especially as a non-native speaker, right, it's very interesting to understand sometimes how we notice the formation of accents in ourselves, how we, how we work on our accents based on what we listen to. It's amazing, right? How the brain responds.
Absolutely, absolutely. And all those different accents and sounds out there. It's gorgeous. It's one of the best things I love about teaching English and being involved in this world, all that variety. It's fantastic.
I agree. And it makes it so wonderful and rich, right? So much for us to explore.
Absolutely.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Hello, everybody. Welcome, world. Welcome, everybody. Hello. I think it's about time I start sharing my screen with everybody. Let me do it. Oops, sorry. Sharing the wrong one. Here, let me do it. Yes. There we go. So hello, everybody. Hello and welcome. Welcome to this second day of the GTF. So much going on and so much is still ahead of us. The Global Teachers Festival 2023, gathering so many important people with so much interesting, things to share. It's amazing. So guys, if you want to take part in our events and to find out about everything firsthand, you can use this QR code to access www.macmillanenglish.com/ALAB, which is the website for our academic learning program. So feel free to explore it. I'm pretty sure you're going to find something that you love. And like I told you, this is just day 2. We still have a full program ahead of us with so many more interesting topics to come and so many more fabulous speakers, just like Rhona Snelling, who is with us today. Hello, Rhona.
Hey.
Before we start, just a quick reminder that all of the people watching here on Zoom will get a certificate of attendance and a virtual goodie bag through email, okay? So within a week from now, you will receive an email with a link so you can access your virtual goodie bag and your personalized certificates, all right? Now, let's talk about our program today. So we have 2 amazing talks ahead of us. And the first one, English in International Working Environments, in the English as a lingua franca context, by the amazing and fabulous Rhona Snelling. And Rhona Snelling is an ELT teacher, editor, and author. She qualified International House and has extensive experience teaching in Europe and New Zealand. She has worked as a content editor for 2 leading ELT publishers and has a master's degree in applied linguistics and second language acquisition from the University of Oxford. And also, she's part of the Macmillan family, right? She is an author in the house and she has contributed loads and loads with the amazing and fabulous series Speaker Mind. So over to you, Rhona.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a lovely welcome, Rodrigo. Thank you. And I will be sharing my screen in a second. Let me just grab that. And hopefully you can all now see my screen. So Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Global Teachers Festival. So my name's Rhona, as Rodrigo's just said, and thank you so much for taking the time to come along today and join me. And if you celebrate Valentine's Day today, it is the 14th of February, so happy Valentine's Day to you. There is lots of linguistic love for you over the next 40 minutes or so in this webinar. And let me just quickly say and reiterate that the slides that we'll go through today will be available to you after the session. So you don't have to take notes, but if you'd like to, then please do so. Also, the recording will be available to you after the session, so you can easily go back and revisit anything. And I'd really like the session to be interactive. So all that means is that I'll ask you some questions as we go along, and I'd like you to use the chat box to answer. And it's already a very, very busy chat box, I can see. So you're going to be very good at that, I know. If you'd rather not use the chat box and you just want to watch and listen, then please do so. That's great. It's your webinar, your choice. So please choose whatever works for you today. So let's get going. So what are we going to be looking at today? So in this webinar, we will 1, identify and explore English as a lingua franca, ELF. 2, we'll discuss techniques to remember and points to ponder. And that's where we'll look at some practical classroom activities and ideas and some things to think about. And 3, we'll share ideas, activities and tips. And in that final section is where I'd like to invite you to share your ideas through a Padlet and help our teacher community. Also, I just want to say I'm aware that I don't know your classes, of course, or the specifics of your teaching context, but I hope there'll be something in here for everyone, and I hope we'll have a really productive and fun session. So let's go. First up then, number 1, identify and explore ELF. So what exactly is ELF? And we do love our acronyms in ELT, don't we? I particularly love them, and you'll find out how much I love them in a minute. But let's look at these descriptors of English learning. And this is not a complete list, of course, just a few examples. So at the top, we've got English for academic purposes. So preparing students for tertiary education or IELTS. We've got English as a foreign language. So preparing students to communicate with L1 English speakers. We've got EIL, English as an international language. I feel that that's a slightly older term now, but I also feel it's a bit of a predecessor for ELF. And here is ELF, English as a lingua franca. We'll look at a precise definition in a second. ELT, English language teaching, of course. ESL, English as a second language. And ESOL, ESOL, English for speakers of other languages. So ESOL and ESOL, both of those are for people not from an English-speaking country, but who are now living in an English-speaking country and are communicating with L1 English speakers. ESP at the bottom there is English for specific purposes. So learning English for a specific industry or profession, so such as aviation or medicine, something like that. Let's look at getting a better definition for ELF. So ELF is the English as the language of communication between people with different L1s. And as Rodrigo said a moment ago, this is exactly what we're doing today. We've all got different L1s, but we're all communicating with each other through one common language, English. And whereas ELT historically may have been more about preparing students to communicate with L1 English speakers, today in 23, it's much more about preparing students to communicate with other English users whose L1 is not English. And it may well be that your students still interact with L1 English speakers, yes, of course, but they're likely to be in the minority. And we can see ELF everywhere in this little list at the bottom of the slide. So it's the language of education, the language of entertainment, the language of the internet. It's the language of the online world, right? We're using English right now, and we're going to come back to online later. It's the language of media. It's the language of officialdom, so governments, rules, diplomacy. English is the official language of 75 countries around the world. It's also a pluricentric language, so it's a language which has official status shared by at least 2 countries. And some other examples of that, there's Arabic, there's Greek, Korean, Portuguese, Urdu, and so on. So it's time for a question for you, if that's okay. So the question is, what percentage of English speakers are not L1 English speakers. And as it's Valentine's Day, you've got a little row of hearts there, which might be able to help you with your guesswork and a percentage. How many do you think? So I'm just looking at the chat box. I've got 75%, 60%, 95, 70, 80, a lot. I agree with that one. Excuse me. Yep, so I think the hearts worked well there. That's a good cue for you. So let me just confirm then that greater than 80% of English speakers are not L1 English speakers. For me, these statistics are always really powerful and a really great reminder of the world in which we live in and how English is being used. You can see those extra statistics at the bottom of the slide. So there's around 1.5 billion English users in the world. Out of that 1.5 billion, we've got around 375 million L1 speakers. So pretty low compared to around 1.2 billion L2 speakers. And here we are now, as I say, an example of that. Could I ask you very quickly, what's your first language? Could you write it in the chat box? We can do a little, not very scientific experiment to see if that 80% is right. Oh, there's loads. Oh, I saw one English. So many different languages. And English is not featuring there at all. So that's interesting. That's great. So we are indeed a perfect example of that statistic. Thank you. Thanks for your answers. There was some very speedy typing. You're all very good. Well done. Fantastic. Let's move on to our next section then. Section 2. So discussing techniques to remember and points to ponder. So I mentioned at the beginning that we do love acronyms in ELT, and I'm a big fan of an acronym. And if you've been to one of my webinars before, you'll know that I like to use an acronym to sort of describe the skills and the tips for that topic. So today's acronym, it's got to be global. We're at the Global Teachers Festival. We're talking about a global language and working in a global context. So can you guess what this first word might be? Can you fill in the gaps? There's a picture there to help you. Oh, there's been a successful guest already. Yeah, so the guesses are all correct. The guesses are indeed guessed. And you're all guests here today at the Global Teachers Festival, just as our students are guests in our lessons. And I'm deliberately using that word guests because my feeling is that we want our students to feel like guests. We want them to be welcomed into our classrooms and to have a really positive experience when they're there. And when your students are out the classroom and when they're working in their international environments, they will be a guest in another culture, or they may be receiving guests from another culture. And thinking about culture, let's look at a quick definition of the meaning of culture. So culture is a set of ideas, beliefs, and recognizable ways of behaving of a particular organization or a group of people. Yeah, because it's not just confined to a country, of course. There's a culture of a region within a country, a company, a club, or a global teachers festival. One of the reasons I love being part of this festival is because of the culture. It's welcoming, it's positive, it's inclusive, it's about sharing and learning. So your students are going to experience some form of culture in whatever work environment they're in currently or they aspire to be in. So also we need to say what culture isn't, and culture isn't just a do and don't list or the 5 Fs. So a do and don't list, that's super easy to Google, right? Or use ChatGPT and you'll get a list of things to do and not to do when you're in other cultures. And that's fine, yeah, as far as it goes. But the trouble is it doesn't actually go that far. By its very nature, it's going to be superficial and it's going to be limited. So in that list, there might be some broad assumptions, some stereotypes, perhaps some unconscious bias. It might be a bit negative. It's probably going to be inaccurate. It just doesn't do justice to all the individual differences within that group. And we know as teachers that individual differences are always present, always important, and we want inclusivity in our lessons. The other thing culture isn't just, and that's the 5 Fs. So food, fashion, famous people, festivals, and flags. It's something we often see in course books. It's something I'm often asked to write about as well. And there is a valid reason for that, because a course book is going to be used across many different countries, many different cultures, And perhaps there's not always the opportunity to drill down into a particular culture. So it's not an easy balance to get right. It's time for another question for you. And this question is, which skills do guests need for international work environments? 1, 2, 3, or 4? What do you think? It could be 1, intercultural skills, ability to comprehend different cultures and viewpoints. Interpersonal skills, ability to build positive relationships and interact positively. Looks like there's lots of 2s and 3s in the answers at the moment. 3, communication skills. So that ability to express your ideas and to convey information or opinions. Lots of people saying all of them. So that means critical thinking skills is also included, not necessarily Bloom and lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills. It could just be thinking critically and strategically. So yeah, a mix of answers. There's quite a lot of people saying all, and I think I'd probably say all, because there's a lot of overlap between these skills. There's cognitive skills, behavioral skills, linguistic skills, and I think all of them, for me, would be useful in international work environments. Let's drill down a little bit deeper and look at some shared sub-skills amongst those 4 skills. Let me show you a few examples. And we've got a heart for you for Valentine's Day. So here are some sub-skills. We've got active listening, self-awareness, diplomacy, empathy, inclusivity, kindness. Can you add some more to the list? Could you use the chat box and give me some other examples of useful sub-skills? What do you think? Caring, yes, thank you, Rosanna, that's great. Acceptance, that's lovely, Halima. Yeah, I like that. Being attentive, flexibility, tolerance, compassion, mindfulness, that's a great one. Tolerance, oh, there's so many answers, they're very quick. Empathy, tolerance, being inquisitive, yeah, that's a great one. Resilient, loyal, yeah, lovely. Caring, patience, respect, reciprocal, yes. Inclusion, curiosity, all of, yes, I agree with all of them. Yes, they're all fantastic ideas. Brilliant, yeah. Using your imagination, yeah, definitely. Love, absolutely. Perfect word for today, isn't it? Lovely. Thank you so much for your suggestions there. Yes, fantastic. I also wanted to mention that whilst we're talking about an international work environment today, all of these sub-skills here in the heart and all the ones that you're mentioning in the chat box, they're important for all students, in my opinion. So if you're introducing these sub-skills to young learners, that would be great. To teenagers, that would also be great, because it's getting that growth mindset and that all-important empathy into the culture of your lessons. And for me, empathy is an absolute fundamental quality for a teacher. I also want to mention a really lovely little linguistic theory, and this is communication accommodation theory from Giles in 1971. Now, there have been a number of developments of the theory since then, which include verbal and non-verbal communication, but this is the starting point. And the theory posits that people adjust or accommodate for their guests their spoken communication to become more or less like others. If it becomes more like others, that's convergence. So there's that coming together, because there's a desire to accommodate that speaker, because they're your guest. We want them to feel listened to, we want them to like us, or we could simply just want that interaction to be successful and easy. Very inclusive, it's very positive. The other side, away from convergence, is divergence. So that's less like others, the opposite, a desire to demonstrate a difference between yourself and others. It might be to assert authority or superiority, to gain control of the interaction. It's not inclusive, and obviously it's quite a negative experience. And I don't know about you, I've certainly experienced communications that have had an element of divergence in them, and it's not very pleasant. It's not a conversation you want to continue with, because the other person clearly doesn't want it to continue. It's a very negative experience, and it makes you feel awful. If we flip that, though, and we think of interactions where people have been friendly, kind, warm, smiling, they're actively seeking to ask you questions, to listen to what you're saying, to listen actively, to build that relationship, that feels great, doesn't it? And the reason I wanted to include this theory, 2 reasons really, that I find it really interesting. One, it just reminds me so much of our role as teachers and the power that we really do have to make our students feel welcome and valued and safe in our class as our guests. We want to build that rapport. We want it to be positive. And secondly, as teachers, we can model this convergence behavior to be positive and inclusive in every single lesson we give. So then your students can replicate that behavior in the class and maybe outside of the class and in their life. A little goes a long way, I think. It's worth remembering that. Another way of accommodating our guests is using communication techniques. A lot of you mentioned some ideas about that in the sub-skills section we just spoke about. So let's look at some examples of communication techniques. So, adapting language. This is from a section called Mediation Confident Communicator from Speak Your Mind. I'm one of the co-authors of that course. And this is a really cool little feature in the course, Confident Communicator. And it's those exact words. It's how we want our students to feel, that they're confident when they can communicate. They're easily prepared to converse in all the different international work environments that they will be in. So this example shows 3 ways of adapting language. A, B, and C, there on the right. We've got A, simplifying, B, explaining, C, giving examples. And this is presented to the students through a conversation with examples of these 3 techniques. So could you, with your classes, perhaps find a conversation, written, spoken, video, or one you've created, and examine these techniques or similar ones with your students? Another example, interpersonal effectiveness. This is from a Skills for Pros feature, again, from Speak Your Mind. It's a really lovely feature, and that explores different communication skills for international work environments. This particular one, as we've said, looks at interpersonal effectiveness. So there's a text there, a short reading text, which describes what the skill is. And that box overlaying the top of the text with 6 tick boxes there, that's a little comprehension check of the text, and it's also a checklist for what interpersonal effectiveness means. So could you perhaps choose one of those skills of interpersonal skills? The sub-skills you mentioned earlier, is the one that you really like, that you could choose, research, and discuss a bit further with your class, and maybe draw up a checklist. Another example, translating for formal communication. So I wanted to include this one because we often have mixed abilities in our classes. That's a reality, right? And it is a bit of a challenge to teach a mixed ability class. And just as we have mixed ability in our class, I think it's good to remember that we have mixed ability within an ELF situation too. Not everyone's going to be the same level. So even if all your students have tested at B1 level, or everyone declares themselves at a particular level, there will still be differences, strengths and weaknesses amongst that group because, hey, there are individual differences. So focusing on something like this, translating and helping, would be a really great communicative skill for our guests. So maybe you could give some English phrases to your students to translate to each other, or if you're in a monolingual class with a shared L1, maybe you could use that and translate into English. The final example we'll look at for this section is managing a difficult conversation. This is another example of the confident communicator feature. So encouraging our students to communicate with confidence, with ease. And this one, looking at managing a difficult conversation, it gives an example of a conversation and it pulls out some really useful language in there. And you can see in that box over the top, there are 3 categories there. We've got asking for an explanation of the situation, summarizing the situation, and inviting suggestions for solutions. And then we've got a few exponents of each of those as examples. So this is something you could do with your students as a role play, perhaps. Let's move on to our next letter. And we've done guest, so we're now on L of global. What could this word be? Halima's in there, super quick. Yep, lots of lovely guesses and lots of lovely correct guesses. Thank you very much, everyone. It is indeed language. And we've got lots of different examples here of international different languages. Today, though, in this section, I'd like to look at target language. So by that, I mean the language that we've made a conscious and deliberate decision to present and teach to our students. And I should also say I'm a big fan of emergent language. So the incidental language that arises naturally and spontaneously through interactions, which we can then use as learning opportunities in the lesson. But that area needs a whole webinar or course to itself. So that's not for today. Let's concentrate on the target language today and look at some examples of useful language you can include for your students. First one, here we go. So this is a nice little article. You can see it's a super simple gap fill. That's it. And it's a little article about a winner of the global, that word again, the Global Teacher Prize. It's a nice gap fill, practicing some grammar, working on the past perfect simple and the past perfect progressive. And I've included this one. It's nothing exciting or dramatic, but I've included it because, for that very reason, because we want our students to still have the language to communicate. It's not just about those communicative skills, it's also about the grammar and the vocab. Your students will still need this breadth of grammar and lexis in order to communicate. It's as simple as that, really. So if you feel that your students need to focus in on a particular piece of grammar, or you need to present something new, go for it, use it, present it. Our next example is an example of target language that deals directly with communication skills. And again, it's looking at interpersonal skills. So this is vocabulary for interpersonal phrases. So we spoke about interpersonal skills earlier, and here we've got some lexis that picks up on that very topic. We've got eye contact, to convey, face to face, and so on. And it's a very simple matching exercise, that's all. We've got the contextualized phrases at the top of the slide there, and then the definitions that students match to at the bottom of the slide. So just as I mentioned, not to neglect the grammar, the same goes for the lexis. If you need to introduce some new language to your students, particularly on a subject like a communication skill, go for it. Give them the language that they need to do just that. And it's not just grammar and vocab that we need to include, it's also pronunciation. So this is a really nice example of a pronunciation point which I think is less daunting than other pronunciation points to teach. And it's also a really important one. It looks quite simple, but I think that's deceptive because we need to have our students expressing themselves and conveying their meaning with accuracy, particularly when they're dealing in an ELF situation. So contrastive stress is the focus of this exercise. And if you look at the very bottom line there, line B in blue, no, we don't live in Peru, we live in Chile. We've just got that contrastive stress to show the correct information. Let's move on to our next letter. We've looked at G for guest, L for language, and now it's O for, what do you think? Online, I think, Suye, were you in there first? I think so. Right, lovely. Thank you. Fast fingers again today. Thank you, everyone. So at the beginning, when we were talking about ELF, we mentioned that English is the language of the internet. So we're going to look at English online for work situations. If you do want to look more at teaching online and motivating students specifically, then have another webinar that I did with Macmillan on that topic, and I'll give you the link for that later. Here today, though, let's look at online work situations. And all these icons here in a work situation, they're all going to be using reading and writing short pieces of text. And yes, you can have longer and more formal emails, absolutely, of course, but let's concentrate on the smaller ones and look at some characteristics that unites them. So, characteristics of online written communication. They're short and snappy, omnipresent, because it's everywhere, isn't it? Online and in all those different social channels. And we're contactable 24 hours of every day, unless we switch off our phone, which I'm not very good at doing myself. Purposeful. So people are communicating with a purpose, to set up a meeting, to introduce ourselves to new contacts, to present a new idea, to make a request. We might just be having a chat, and don't underestimate that. It's one of my favorites. But we also know from thinking about interpersonal skills that building a rapport, building a relationship is important. So don't underestimate just having a chat. It's semi-spontaneous. So for me, these types of online written communication are a lot less planned than those longer formal emails. And it's more casual. For me, it feels a lot less formal. Let's have a look at an example of one. So this is an online conversation between two colleagues. is an example that shows a few of those characteristics we just mentioned. So it's short and snappy. You see those short lines there in the different parts of the conversation. It's purposeful. The purpose is to find out about a hotel that one of the speakers is staying at, and it's quite casual and chatty. It also shows on that page the need for basic language input, which we spoke about earlier. Now, this is from starter level, so it's very much for students at the beginning of their language learning journey. So it looks at basic writing skills, the use of punctuation, short subject, verb, object sentences. And there's also a neat little activity at the bottom there called Make It Digital, to send 2 text messages to different classmates in English. So students are practicing their online digital skills as well as English. Perfect preparation for an online work environment. What other activities can you do with your students? Well, some of these might be nice to try, and they're in order from easy-ish to huge at the bottom. So starting at the top, you could do a little written role play, sending instant messages, like the example we just looked at. You could ask your students to write a social media post. You could have them respond to a job advert. So could you find a job advert and show it to your students and ask them to respond? Could they create a poster or an advertisement for something related to their work? Could they research and edit some written work? Maybe you could use ChatGPT for that and make the text even better. Could you get your students to set up a LinkedIn profile? And I'm on LinkedIn, so do say hello to me there. And the big one, the biggest one as well, that creating a website. So that might be something, because it's so big, it's maybe project-based, and you might want to do that over a number of weeks with your class. It may be appropriate for some contexts. And amongst all of this talk about writing, hand in hand with writing is, of course, the skill of reading. And we mentioned active listening back a while ago as a sub-skill for students. So how about active reading? I'd encourage you to think about that as well. And it's just like active listening in that we're observing the other person's style and mirroring and encouraging that. So in written communication, you can ask your students to think about how someone has written to them. What salutation did they use? Did they use dear? Did they say hi? How did they use their own name? How did they choose to use it? In its full form, Thomas, in a short form, Tom, Tommy, or Mr. Green, more formal. And what's the general formality or register? What's the language and tone of that communication? What's the length? Is it short? Is it long? Did they use emojis? I am a huge fan of emojis. I like using them, but I don't think I ever really use them until I've received a message with an emoji in, and then I release all of my emojis proudly and happily. And then last but by no means least, their response, because it's an ongoing thing, active reading. So we want to keep making sure that we're listening actively to the formality, the use of emojis, the name choice. We want to make sure we're still dealing correctly, respectfully with the person. It's time for our next letter. And it's B for, what do you think? Balance. I think, who's in there first? Alina, maybe? Okay, it is indeed. B for balance. Thank you, lovely. And I've got 2 questions for you to ponder here. So these aren't for you to answer now in the chat box, just to think about at your leisure later. So to ponder, are we providing enough balance of strategic competence and linguistic competence? So we absolutely want that strategic competence, those 4 communication skills we looked at in G for guest, intercultural skills, interpersonal skills, communication skills, critical thinking skills. And for that balance, we want the linguistic competence too. So we want all those basic language skills that we looked at in L for language and just now in O for online. The second question to ponder, are we reflecting enough on our own teaching practice? And this can be as small or as large as you want. It could be as simple as a few minutes reflecting on a lesson afterwards, what went well, what could be improved. I'm going to do that after this webinar. It could be trying a whole new lesson model in your classroom, maybe trying to work with emergent language, for example. It could be helping other colleagues, sharing a lesson plan, sharing an idea, or doing peer observation. It's whatever you want it to be. Time for our next letter, and it is A for there's some good pronunciation fans out here. I'm a bit of a phonology geek, so it's lovely to see I'm not alone. That's brilliant. Thank you, everyone. And perfect spelling and typing. So it is indeed accent. So we've just looked at writing skills in the online section. So let's now look at the other output skill, speaking. And let's return to ELF. And hey, here's another acronym, the LFC, Lingua Franca Core. And this is such an easy area that we can recognize and utilize in our teaching right now. So the Lingua Franca Core was born out of research from the classroom. This is found by Jenkins in 2000. I'll give you the reference for that later on. And this research was done into how L2 speakers in multilingual classes were using English. So it's firmly rooted in the classroom, which is fantastic, I think. So the pronunciation features of intelligible EFL output are, and let me quickly point out that we're looking at intelligible output, comprehensible, that's it. So the four features are vowel length. So we've got the short vowels, I, E. We've got the long vowels, E, U, and we've got the diphthong, A. Most consonants are also important. Consonant clusters, like these ones shown in global, the G and the L, and in teacher, the C and the H, and word grouping and nuclear stress. So four very interesting, useful features of intelligible EFL output. And what I like about this is that it goes from the small to the large. So it goes down into the segmental work. It looks at individual sounds or phonemes, those vowels, I, E, U, E, A. It looks at those segments and it goes up to the supra-segmental level. So the melody of our speech, the rhythm, the pitch and the intonation, that's picked up in word grouping and nuclear stress. Another thing I find quite interesting about looking at those individual sounds is that if you also teach very young learners and you're used to teaching with phonics, think about that segmenting and blending work that's super important for those children. So it's blending a consonant, a vowel and a consonant. K, A, T, cat, to get that initial familiarization between word and sound and developing the vocabulary. It's so important in every area of English. And the nuclear stress, the one right at the bottom, just to point out, that simply means the most prominent stressed word in a tone group. So that could be for emphasis or it could be for contrast. And we've actually already seen an example of this when we looked at the pronunciation example. Do you remember the no, we don't live in Peru, we live in Chile. It's that simple. So all of these are great features that are recognizable in your teaching and easy to teach. And do we need to teach them? Why bother? Well, yes, absolutely, because the LFC helps to raise awareness of the ELF context in working environments. It prepares students for real-life English interactions. It reminds students of the dominance of L2 speakers. It encourages students to reflect on spoken output, and it promotes inclusivity and personal identity. And I think this final point is probably my favorite, because the Lingua Franca Core is about intelligibility. As I said, it's not about pushing students towards a particular target sound that's either right or wrong. It really allows students to maintain their own voice, like literally maintain their own voice and their accent and their identity. So some more questions for you to ponder now. So what do students think of accents, theirs or others? Could 80% of your pronunciation activities in class focus on the LFC? Could 20% of your pronunciation activities focus on other areas outside of the LFC? And why am I saying 80% and 20%? That's because that statistic right at the beginning we looked at, that more than 80% of English users are L2 English speakers. So we want to replicate that in our classroom and prepare our students for the real world that they will be communicating in and working in internationally. And 20% of pronunciation activities from other areas, that's everything that you're probably already doing. So things like contrastive stress that we looked at, word stress, maybe minimal pairs work, syllable stress, individual sounds, all of those would be great. And intonation, so important to pick up that super segmental work of phonology. So we are moving on to our final letter. We've done guest, language, online, balance, accents. So our final one is L for, oh, and there's a little heart for you, some linguistic love. What is the missing word? And I think Annie maybe was first in there. Thank you very much. Love should be in there, shouldn't it? But doesn't quite fit. So it's learn is the answer here. And I think I've included this simply because we are always learning as teachers, as students, as humans. We said earlier about that importance of developing all those sub-skills and developing that growth mindset. So in this final section, I'd love to learn about your thoughts and your ideas about ELF and your experiences and how you're preparing your students for international working environments. I know from the chat box, you're going to have loads of fantastic ideas. So here's that final invitation I mentioned. Share ideas, activities, and tips. So this final section is yours and your chance to share with all of our friends in the teaching community. But how? Allow me to tell you. You can do this two ways. So one, you could share this webinar or some ideas from it with your colleagues. If you're doing that online, then do tag me on LinkedIn. I'd love to see. And or would you like to collaborate in a Padlet? So there's the QR code for you there on the screen to take a picture of. Or there's the address, and that's padlet.com/Rhona Snelling/global. And also on that Padlet, there are the references I mentioned to you from today. So there's some further reading around ELF, some great books from Jennifer Jenkins. There's some links to some corpora if you wanted to explore vocabulary a little bit more there. And because it's Valentine's Day and I want you to have a nice gift, there's a little lesson plan there on accents. And the final thing to ask you, our acronym today was global. So can I ask you, what did the G stand for? Guest, I think, Shawi, you were in there first. Guest, thank you. We had guest, then we had L for, what did L stand for? Language, and I missed your name. Thank you, whoever was in there, super quick. So guest, language. O was online. Yes, thank you. Guest, language, online. B was balance. Such fast typing, amazing. A, we've just looked at, that's a super easy one, isn't it? Accent, lovely. And then the final letter L, learn. Super, thank you so much. Lovely. So I will just say a huge thank you very much for sharing your time with me today. Thank you for all your amazing participation and enthusiasm and busyness in the chat box. That's been brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for taking part so actively. If you'd like to join the Padlet, please do. There's the address again for you. Or if you want to say hello to me, please do. That would also be lovely. And I will hand you back to Rodrigo now and stop sharing my screen. Thank you, everyone, again. Hi.
Thank you, Rhona, for this amazing talk. It's so insightful. There are so many interesting details we need to pay attention to, right? Sometimes they look like they're small details, but they tend to have a huge impact. Oh my God, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Great. Well, we have a few questions. Let me ask you a question from Facebook by Zakir Ullah. What is the difference between English as an international language and English as a global language?
I think the short answer is very little. I've not heard it described English as a global, like EGL. So that's not an acronym I'm familiar with, but I'd say they're the same. And as I mentioned earlier, for me, EIL is a bit of an older term now. I don't hear it around as much. compared to in the past. So it's probably been usurped now by ELF, or maybe English as a global language.
Amazing. I think there's time for another one. Could you please throw some light on ELF as a tool for language assessment?
Oh, for language assessment. Well, I think then you've got to root your assessment completely in L2 speakers. So you're not looking at any L1 models. You're looking at that. It's probably using that Lingua Franca core to look at the speaking assessments, that you've got the intelligibility of those vowel sounds, of the segments, and you've got that comprehensibility in the super segmental sounds. And you want to also include some of that vocabulary we looked at, like the interpersonal phrases, picking up on some of those. So I think it's the best way to approach assessment, thinking what it is you want to assess, and then seeing if your students are able to deliver that. And if not, then what can you do to push them towards that correct language, that useful language?
Very interesting. Yeah, and lots of food for thought, right? Throughout your talk. I bet there were many eureka moments for lots of the viewers here with us, like, that makes total sense, or So amazing contributions as always, Rhona. Thank you very, very much.
My absolute pleasure.
And audience, as Rhona showed in her session, it is crucial to teach young adult learners the communication and language skills that will help them succeed in international working environments, right? Speak Your Mind offers young adult learners everything they need to thrive in their future professional careers. The course gives the students plenty of opportunities to practice communication skills whilst learning how to solve problems, make plans and decisions, and express their point of view clearly and confident. Special follow-up role and skills for pros material includes real-life videos that make students familiar with the specifics of different jobs and equip students with necessary language skills. So you can discover all amazing features of Speak Your Mind, authored by the amazing Rhona Snelling, and try and test the course with the students by downloading sample units at macmillanenglish.com/Speak Your Mind, okay? So there's the website. And if you want to contact your local Macmillan Education sales representative, okay, all you got to do is to fill out the form now to be contacted by your local representative, okay? So you can find out more about this amazing series, Speak Your Mind, and all about all our amazing series, all right? So guys, I'll give you one extra second to take a picture of the QR code if you want to. And I am here again to remind you that everyone watching on Zoom will get within a week, okay? So do not get desperate. I know that sometimes we are a bit, anxious, but give it a week, and you will get an email with a link to access your personalized certificate of attendance and your virtual goodie bags, okay? So within a week, you will get an email and you will be able to access both the certificate of attendance and the virtual goodie bag. All right, so don't forget it. And now, what happens now, because we have so much going on, so there's another amazing talk by Mikhail Peridovsky. So if you want to watch this next session, stay here, okay? You don't have to do anything. You are in the right room, in the right Zoom conference room. So just stay here. You don't need to do anything, okay? But there's also an amazing product showcase going on about Speak Your Mind series. So if you want to check it out, check out the link in the chat box so you can see it, okay? But if you want to check out and watch the next session, which English will give our students the best mileage by Mikhail Peridovsky, stay here. You don't have to do anything, okay? And speaking of Mikhail Peridovsky. So he is a professor and teacher trainer at the Institute of Applied Linguistics, University of Warsaw, and a research and language teaching consultant. His interests include second language acquisition and instruction, English as a lingua franca, study abroad, and social network analysis. He gave over 210 invited lectures, seminars, and workshops in Europe, Asia, America, Oceania, and Africa. And Mikhail's edited volumes are Teaching Languages Off the Beaten Track and Producing Foreign Languages Skills for an Intercultural World. His monograph is titled Am Other Mother, it's amazing this name, Tongues in Language Acquisition, Instruction, and Use. So Mikhail, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Over to you. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, and thanks everyone. It's wonderful to be here again after the morning session. It was very energizing, so I'm looking forward to the same again. And I'm really happy to be presenting after Rhona because I will be building up on what she has just presented. So let me take it off with the slides, and then I'm going to just need a second to arrange everything on my screen. I think this looks good. Right. So we were talking about English as a lingua franca, and that is indeed the topic of this presentation. So let me start off with checking how much you remember from Rhona's presentation. And to that end, there are two questions up here on the screen. If you can quickly give your estimates of what percentage of the speakers or the global population, in your opinion, can communicate in English? And then among those that can communicate in English, what is the proportion of non-native speakers versus native speakers? And that was something that Rhona mentioned in her presentation. And let's now see the outcomes. Well, actually, English is only spoken by around 1/3 of the global population, so there are still a majority that do not speak the language. But among those that do, there are different estimates depending on the author that you check. And these range from 80% non-native speakers, 20% native speakers, to anything in the range of 92% non-native users and only 8% native users. And this disproportion is projected to still increase with time. And this has two consequences. One is that this world language is no longer shaped exclusively by native users. And the other is that in many cases, the only place where our learners may get in contact with native speakers may be the English language classroom. Then they may leave the classroom, they may go elsewhere and still use the language, but to other non-native users like themselves. So what happens in most of the cases, for most of the learners, is that they don't necessarily try to copy the conventions of what native speakers do with the language. Actually, there's often the expectation that our learners are going to become native speakers, but that has sometimes been likened to what is called the Spanish waiter paradox. Why the Spanish waiter? If you're familiar with the TV series 40 Towers, you may be familiar with Manuel, who's a waiter in a provincial hotel. And let's perhaps introduce Manuel for just a second.
You see, I speak English well. I learn it from a book. Hello, I am English. Hello. How are you, sir? I can speak English. Hello, Major. How are you today? I'm fine, thank you. It's a beautiful day today.
Is it? Oh, yes, yes, I suppose it is.
Yes, I can speak English. I learned it from a book.
Did you? Did you really? Oh, there you are, Faultier.
Yes, I'm just going to open up, Major.
Oh, fine. I say that's a remarkable animal you have there, Faultier. Where did you get it?
Samson's in the town.
Really? Well, what was it, expensive?
£12, I think.
Good Lord. Japanese, was it?
Canadian, I think, Major.
Yeah, I didn't know the Canadians was clever as that. My God.
He started early.
Now, Manuel does actually want to pass off for a native speaker, but for most learners today, that's not the goal. What they want is what Rhona was telling about earlier today. That is, they want to preserve their identity while using the language for effective communication. So the processes that are affecting the English language, such as language spread, variation, and adaptability, are natural processes affecting any natural language. But in the case of English, these are actually additionally accelerated and intensified by the non-native users. Now, if you're zooming in from Europe, then you might have a hunch that English is not actually the most spoken native language on the continent, because that first place goes to German. But then if we add on people who are able to communicate in the language, irrespective of whether they are first, second, or third language users, then we can see that the German language is the runner-up, but it only can boast half the speakers that English has. And of course, different countries across Europe are more or less proficient in the language. There are numerous reasons for that state of affairs. On a global scale, it's a bit more difficult to estimate the numbers of speakers of different languages, but such estimates have been made. And here we can again see that English is at the top, closely followed by Putonghua and then Hindi. The difference, of course, is that the second and third languages on this list are typically quite confined geographically. So they have a lot of speakers, but in a certain area of the world. Otherwise, you won't really get a lot of mileage with that language elsewhere. So this is not a situation that is entirely novel, the English language serving as a bridge language. This began with the colonization in the 16th century. But it was only in the last couple of decades that this growth took on an exponential turn. And where we can see that for most learners, the goal of interaction is with other non-native users like themselves. And this is also what you can see in the connotations that people have with the language, or rather the connotations that they don't have with the English language. So Katja Lochtman carried out a very interesting study at Vrije Universiteit in Brussels. I just came back from there, where she asked students at the university about their associations they had with different languages. And students would typically have connotations. So thinking of French, they'd think of romanticism. German would evoke ideas of Ordnung and being organized and disciplined. Slavic languages had their associations, but not so the English language. Because for the students, the English language was not the language of the UK or of America or of Australia. To them, it was the language that they use with their classmates, foreign classmates. It's the language they use to speak to tourists. It's the language that they use when they themselves travel, rather than being chained to a particular culture. So English as lingua franca, or English as an international language, there are different preferences on the two sides of the Atlantic, and there are also some nuances, but generally the terms refer to any instance of the English language that arises when two persons communicate in the English language without having the same native language. And in the past, native speakers would be excluded from that kind of communication, but today there is consensus among researchers that native speakers can also partake in ELF interactions as long as they try to make themselves understood and as long as they make the effort to understand the interlocutor. Now, that does not always happen. So I'm going to recite a conversation between a room service and a guest in a hotel in Southeast Asia. This is a conversation that was brought to my attention first by Robin Walker several years ago. So that exchange went more or less like this. Money, room service. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I liked room service. Right, room service, money, do you wish to order something? Yes, I like some bacon and eggs. How'd you like them? What? Eggs. How'd you like them? Pie, boy, poach. Oh, the eggs, how do I like them? Sorry, scrambled, please. How'd you like the bacon? Crisp? Crisp would be fine. Okay, and Santos? What? Santos, do you like Santos? I don't know, I don't think so. No, do you want toast? Look, I feel really bad about this, but I don't know what do you want toast means. Toast. Why do you want toast? Oh, well, it's English muffin with butter. English muffin, I've got it, I understand now. You were saying toast, fine. An English muffin would be just fine. With butter? No, just put the butter on the side. What? I'm sorry, I meant butter. Please put the butter on the side. Coffee? I feel terrible about this, but coffee, tea, milk. Coffee, yes, coffee, please, and that's all. 1 minute, Jodo, strangled eggs, crisp bacon, English muffin with butter, honey, side, and coffee, all right? Whatever you say. Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome. All right, so that's how some conversations go. But it's not necessarily the reason that one of the persons is a native speaker and one of the persons is a not native speaker, as we're going to see. But first, let's interrogate a few terms out there. Let me just turn on the lights because otherwise I'm looking a bit ghostly here. I hope this is going to help. So if you were asked to define who a native speaker is, you could probably come with a few criteria. Some would be more, some would be less obvious. Regarding the less obvious ones, let me give you another question. That is, please watch this short video and tell me what language Wang Ho Chang is a native speaker of. So here comes the video.
Found a funny South Korean. He's here with us tonight. I'm going to introduce you to him. Please put your hands together for Wang Ho Chang. Wang Ho Chang. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Wang Ho Chang. So, Wang Ho, thanks for coming out and being our special guest, our special weapon, if you will. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the beautiful people of Dubai?
안녕하세요. 나는 한국 사람이요. 나는 이름 원호 인속 일본 영원청.
I have no idea what he said, but here's what I'd like to do. I'm just going to give you the microphone, and I'd like you to entertain the people of Dubai. Maybe do a song and dance, if you will. Is that okay? Do you guys want to hear Wang Ho Chang? Want some? Okay. Wang Ho Chang, everybody. Okay, that's good. You'll be fine. Just go ahead and go. Just go right in the front. Right in the front. Wang Ho Chang, everybody.
وعدينا يا شو عدينا على بر الهوى راسينا أنا عمري معاك وهوايا هواك عدينا يا شو عدينا. ضحكت عليكم ولا لا؟ الصدمة اللي انتوا فيها عادي جدا، بتصير معي كل يوم. كل يوم من حياتي ناس بنصدموا انه كيف واحد كوري بيحكي عربي؟ معقول؟ مرة كنت بالشغل راكب الاليفيتر، فتح الباب، دخلت وقفت، بفوت وراي واحد خليجي، فماشي وبتطلع مش عاجبه، يعني انه يا اخي طلع هذا شعره كيف واقف. قلت له مش فاهم يعني حلو ولا مش حلو؟ قال لي لا مرة حلو. على كل for all those who are non-Arabic speakers, I do apologize, but there's a Showtime initiative to launch stand-up comedy in Arabic. Hence my presence on stage. So yeah, big ups. So anyways, I'll introduce myself again. My name is Wan Ho. No joke. I swear. أظن أهلي لما إجوا بدهم يسموني إنه what shall we name him? Wan Ho, because it's funny in the States. It'll make for good comedy. Anyways, my name is Wan Ho. أبوي كوري، أمي فيتنامية، وعشت كل حياتي بالأردن.
All right, so what language is Wan Ho Chang a native speaker of? Well, we can see that this is not always an easy question to answer. Here's a fragment of a PhD dissertation defended in Switzerland last May, where you can see that the person's first language or the language that they were born with need not necessarily be their most proficient language or the language that they like best. So essentially, once a second or a third language creeps into the picture and that language becomes the person's dominant language, you have a trouble defining what language that person is a native speaker of. Let's say someone was born to a binational family in the UK, and then they moved away to another country when that person was 7 years old, and the language of that country became their dominant language. Would you say that they are still a native speaker of English, if that's not their dominant language? What if they moved when they were 12 years old? What if they moved if they were 15 years old? You have a problem. So the only foolproof criterion of defining a native speaker is if someone's monolingual, or if someone does speak other languages, but they are not at the same level of proficiency as the language they were born into and the one that they were brought up in and they're using today. Now, another term that is highly problematic is that of a proper, real, or standard English. Already back several centuries ago, people were complaining about the purity of the English language being contaminated by words from other languages. But the problem is that even if you wanted to voice those concerns, you needed to actually use words that were borrowed from the other languages, as indicated here in a green font. But basically, if you take a reference grammar, for instance, Randolph Quirk's A Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, that's more or less this thick, it's 1889 pages, no exercises, it's just morphal syntax. There will be things in that book that many native speakers are unaware of. And there will also be things or linguistic phenomena used by native speakers that will not be in that reference volume. And here I'm not even venturing into what someone might call substandard varieties or generally varieties other than the one that is deemed the prestigious one, because speakers of those varieties will never be told that they're not legitimate users of those varieties. But when the same phenomena happen in the language classroom, then very often the teacher is going to tell the students that these are mistakes and that these should be corrected. So we can see a double standard there. Now, of course, the reason for that situation is that the English language today, as Rhona mentioned earlier, is a pluricentric language. It doesn't have one common source. You have several national varieties, broad brush strokes, and then within those countries, you have sub-varieties that often are not actually mutually comprehensible, even within the same country. Some examples. Here are just a few terms that are used in cookbooks, recipes, menus, in the English language on both sides of the Atlantic, and you can see the differences between the terms and how sometimes they may be actually bigger than just superficial ones. Here's an account of a story when a passenger flying from Australia on a US airline used an expression, third income, that is probably one of the first Australian expressions you're going to use. US presidents who would be visiting Australia would learn that expression and try to weave it into their speech. Now, when that expression was used by a passenger, a flight attendant thought that she was being offended. So when the aircraft landed, there were the police waiting for the passenger on the tarmac because the flight attendant didn't know that Australian expression. Even small words can mean something completely different in the UK and the US, for instance. Small words such as quite, the meaning can be quite different. And then even within one country, you can go a few miles and you're going to need a different word for a commonplace thing. For instance, the cake that you serve with afternoon tea. Basically, a few miles and you cross an isogloss and you're in an area that uses a different word for the same cake. And of course, the different words or the different dialects will come with different associated levels of prestige ascribed to them. Here's another account from the news where a guy from Liverpool got accosted by the police because people were thinking that the guy was drunk and he was in charge of a child, whereas he was just speaking the Liverpool dialect. And importantly, if you think of dialects or variants that you might consider prestigious, those are not the ones that are regarded as the most friendly or the most kind or the most funny or the dialects that people would like their date to speak. Every time you ask a different question concerning the associations with the different variants, you will have a different response coming up as the preferred variant of choice. But most of the time, it's not going to be so-called received pronunciation, which in itself is a very problematic term. Because if you read David Crystal, for instance, I highly recommend the presentation of his and his son Ben coming up this week, then you will find out that RP is used by fewer than 2% of the English population. Not the UK population, not the British population. Fewer than 2% of English men and English women use RP. And that means that if you're choosing that as your model of instruction for your students, you could actually be accused of teaching your students something that does not really exist. Even Queen Elizabeth, late Queen Elizabeth, didn't speak the same variant or the same accent in the latter stages of her life as she used to when she was younger. All right, so if it's not RP, then you might still want to choose a variant as your model. So where do you go? Okay, let's go for a country that has the highest number of native speakers of English. That's going to be the US. Now, the problem there is that if you look at a map of US dialects or American English dialects, and you look around the area of Boston, that's more or less where you would place Standard American, then you're going to see that that patch spreads a bit around, but it's by no means the most spoken variant of English in the US either. So it's by no means anything standard for the US alone. And then you may be familiar with those maps that show you which expressions are used to denote a certain object. Here you can see that if you want to buy a carbonated or fizzy drink or a soda in the US, then you need to know which word to use for that generic term, because it's not the same term that's going to be used on the coast of the Atlantic and on the coast of the Pacific and in the Midwest and in the South, because you need actually different terms for one and the same thing from one and the same company. So, but still, there's this deep-rooted idea and misconception that it's the native speakers that are the providers of standards, and therefore, if we go by this logic, that anything that diverges from that is going to be treated as errors. And the native speakerism is still often being sold off as a unique selling point. So the photo you can see here, I took that in a bookstore after I was guest teaching in Germany, and you can see how speaking like a native is actually treated as a unique selling point for that calendar there. Now, let me make an important aside here, because quite a lot of us, of course, use language tasks with our students, and quite a lot of us are teaching classrooms where almost all the students, or even if not all the students, share the same first language. And then we are often tempted to give them tasks where they have to reach a certain goal, but we tell them that the goal must be achieved via the means of the English language, which may be a bit artificial. Because remember that for English as a lingua franca, the English language is used because you don't share the same first language with your interlocutor, so you resort to a bridge language. But sometimes there may not be enough motivation to really present a task to your students. Let me give you an example of where this was done in a manner that was not motivated well enough. So here you can see a task that was assigned to a student as homework. You're a Chinese immigrant in the US, and you're supposed to write a letter home describing your experiences. So the student begins to write. And so on and so forth, right? I've been living here very poorly, and then they go on their account. Now the student did the task. They're an immigrant back in the 19th century. They're probably not a Harvard scholar. And even if they were really highly educated in that language, why would they use that language to write to their family back in China, right? So we really need to think clearly and to motivate the tasks so that students can see that these are tasks that they themselves might have to navigate in the future rather than just perform the task in English for the sake of the task. Now, ELF, English as a lingua franca, can also be well placed in the paradigm of translanguaging, that is, using the students' or existing semiotic and linguistic resources that they have at their disposal. That means also all the other background languages that they speak. And it refers to the use of those languages both in the classroom and outside. As we're going to see later, successful communication in English as a lingua franca often includes terms from other languages if you know that your interlocutor may be familiar with those terms, even though they may not exist in English, but in the other languages. One more term that needs interrogating here is that of a language variety, because many people think that lingua franca is a language, or English as a lingua franca is a language variety. A lingua franca is a socio-cultural construct that a language variety is a socio-cultural construct that refers to a language that's used in a certain territory by people sharing a certain cultural background. Now, by definition, English as a lingua franca is used when someone leaves their speech community or someone comes to your speech community and you're using English as the common denominator. Now, if we want to find a term for the community of speakers that use English to that goal, then a better term than a language variety is community of practice. So the aim of interactions in English as a lingua franca is communicative efficiency or intelligibility, and that is different from grammatical correctness. So typical trademarks of successful ELF interaction are adding redundancy, repetition, over-regularization, translanguaging, so the inclusion of other languages, both at the level of the clause and the level of lexical items. Sometimes this may be innovation or terms that you invent because you think that they might exist in English because of the other languages that you know. And actually, sometimes those terms may not exist in English, but they may carry the message across. To make this a bit more tangible, here are a few aspects of syntax that characterizes successful ELF communication. And you might at this point be looking at that list and saying, so all very well what he's saying, but these are just a few examples of common mistakes in the English language. That's very true, but what distinguishes these from others is that when these happen, communication is typically successful, whereas with many other mistakes, and I'm going to show some examples, communication may break down. Now, in terms of pronunciation, Rhona already mentioned the Lingua Franca core. This was research done by Jenny, originally done by Jenny Jenkins, when she analyzed communication among second foreign language users of English, and then those aspects that were deemed crucial for international intelligibility were part of the core. Those that were outside or not crucial went outside. So let's see what is important to be successful in international communication. Consonants. Not all languages have this full repertoire of consonants that the English language has, so these have to be learned. Importantly, though, with the exception of interdentals, and interdentals, the and the, are usually some of the most difficult consonants for learners of English because they are rare across the world's languages. Plus, often people are a bit ashamed of being seen with their tongue sticking between their teeth. But actually, if the sounds are approximated, for instance, to further or to tide, which actually happens a lot in Irish, often the context will suffice to disambiguate the message. What else is important? It's not so important whether you pronounce the consonants in the right place or the one that is expected. Let's say if you pronounce your T with the tip of your tongue at the alveolar ridge or at the base of your teeth or at the tip of your teeth, doesn't matter as long as it's obvious that it's a T. Aspiration, that's this puff of air accompanying unvoiced stops, that's important. Clusters. Many languages have only open syllables and have no clusters. In Polish, you can stack 5 consonants one after another. You can say pstryknąć. You have 5 consonants there. That's not a problem for us. But for many languages, it is a problem. What's the best solution there? If you want to simplify your task, that's the last item here, epenthesis. That is the insertion of a tiny vowel, imagine a schwa, in between the consonants to break up the cluster. I observed it myself among a naive speaker of English, so to say. So once after my lectures in Japan, I was taking a boat tour, and towards the end, the driver said, "Ruto basu stopu." What was the driver doing? Well, he was inserting vowels after the final consonants to break up the syllables and to make them open syllables. And everyone understood what he meant. In terms of vowels, vowel length is important, much more so than vowel quality. And then in terms of prosody or intonation, it's not important whether you stress the word on the last syllable or the penultimate syllable or the first syllable. What's more important is that you accentuate the key word in your message. Outside the core, you've got production of interdentals, exact quality of the vowels, weak forms. Weak forms will be important if your learners are going to be too exposed to native speaker speech or to highly fluent speech, because they have to be able to reconstruct the message. But weak forms are damaging to international intelligibility. Epenthesis, insertion of the small vowel, word stress, rhythm, these don't matter for international intelligibility. And then you can now go back and try to think about the classes that you may have taken and how much attention your teachers may have accorded to those classes and whether that was really worth the investment. Maybe attention had better been placed elsewhere. Because, and again, studies have shown that being a non-native speaker may actually, or speaking with a non-native accent may be more intelligible and more effective than speaking with a native accent. This comes from a study by one student of mine. Let's listen to this short exchange in the Housing Committee of the British Parliament and see how even Britons talking to other Britons may have a hard time understanding one another.
Mr. Speaker, I know from speaking to a number of parliamentary colleagues that there are still certain aspects of the estate, including the Northern Estate, that are not great for people with disabilities. Can I ask the honourable gentleman what work is being done to make sure that this place is more accessible, particularly for some of our colleagues who have a disability?
Here, here.
I'm sorry, it must be something to do with my Antipodean background. Could you please repeat the question, because I didn't follow it?
Well, very popular today. I'm saying that a number of parliamentary colleagues who have disabilities do find it quite difficult getting around certain parts of the estate. Given that we're doing this refurbishment work, what can be done to make sure that those with a disability are able to move around more freely and the place is accessible?
I'm really sorry. Please, could you do it very slowly in Antipodean English? Thank you.
Just give any old answer.
I think the answer might be helped if you can reply in writing when you'll read. Right, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'll try it on the first go.
Oh, no,
Can I? Because I'm Welsh, so God.
Right, so David Linden represents Glasgow, and he's evidently not understood by Paul Beresford, who spent a few decades of his life in New Zealand. So this is how Linden commented on Twitter later on. And of course, you will probably easily find videos of politicians using English as their second or their third language in being much more efficient and, importantly, being much more achievable role models for your students. Now, this doesn't mean that the task is necessarily much easier, because there are some competencies that need to be complemented and that weren't always there in the programs or syllabi. So instead of the culture of specific countries, what's more important is intercultural communicative competence. That is the awareness that other people may have different norms, expectations, routines. Strategy competence, that is what to do when communication breaks down and how to overcome that. Relations and building rapport. And instead of, again, national cultures, what is called small cultures. That is, for instance, if you have students who want to learn English because they want to work in an English-speaking hospital, then what's important for them is the culture of communicating in such medical settings. And I mentioned that it's not that anything goes. This comes from our own work, where you can see that the second item from the top, that is wrong word order or wrong tense choice, can actually contribute to communication breakdown. So it's not that anything goes. We need to know what works, and we need to know what really needs our attention as teachers. So it's not that English as a lingua franca is a bastardized language, and it's also not that it's an invented form of language. There were attempts in the past to construct languages for learning purposes, but those were always cases of one guy sitting down and writing down what they thought would work without really doing any actual research. So what's important here is that what's natural and frequent in native speaker usage may not necessarily be pedagogically useful as examples to learn from, and we may want to redefine authentic as not used by native speakers, but as used by experts. And one more important and I think valid point here, or notion here that's very useful, is that is a Swiss notion of functional plurilingualism. That is the recognition that when we speak multiple languages, each of the languages will be developed to a different extent and in different realms, because we need them for different goals. And to make this tangible, here you can see a pentalingual speaker raised in a Croatian household, but in Switzerland. And you can see that her listening and conversation skills are strongest in the language of the home and the language of the street, that is Croatian and Swiss German. But her reading and writing are strongest in Standard German. That's the language of schooling, because it's at school that you learn to read and write. And this is very characteristic for most multilingual speakers today. And it's very different from high-stakes mainstream exams such as Trinity, IELTS, TOEFL, Cambridge exams, where in order to get a certificate stating that you're at B2 levels, for instance, you have to be at B2 in speaking, listening, reading, writing, interaction, mediation. You fail a component, you don't get the certificate, but that's not the goal or the reality of most language learners today. So I'm not necessarily saying that we should offer ill-formed constructions, but we should offer our learners an informed choice, whether they want to invest time and energy and approximate native models, or whether they just want to be intelligible and successful in that communication. And typically as teachers, we always need to cut corners. So research from ELF can tell us what we can turn a blind eye to. This also means that we don't need to correct all the errors that may be too intimidating, plus the students may not yet be at a stage when they will be able to take in all that knowledge. So it's better to focus on those errors that are really communicatively important. And to complement our instruction with strategic competence, intercultural communicative competence, rapport building. So I'm going to finish off with very quickly showing you how this can be done. In the morning, I chose Cantonese and Putonghua examples. Today, now in this session, a different language. So I'm taking a list of problems that French speakers who are learning English have been shown to demonstrate in class, and then I'm going to filter that against what we know is important for ELF communication, and the paler the font, the less important an issue is. So I'm going to go through it very quickly because that's just a proof of concept, so to say. So you can see that there are quite a list of problems that speakers of French have when they're learning English. This is intimidating to know for learners and for teachers. So how can we ease the learning load? Okay, so now we're going to use some paler font for some areas, and we can see that some points practically disappear. Some are almost not there, but it's basically much more digestible, both for the teacher and for the learner. All right, so the last slide, if your students ask you what model they should be learning and whether they have to be grammatically correct, and if you want to encourage them to be flexible and to be courageous and to just engage in communication, you can, for instance, tell them a rap such as this one. Listen up, you all. I got a story to tell about language that's breaking down barriers like a spell. Perhaps it's not what you might know of, different from the standard for sure. Native speakers claim they got it right, but they just hold us back, keeping us in the fight. Language is dynamic, always changing and growing. They trying to hold it back, but English keeps flowing. They want to tell us what's correct, what's not, but who made them the boss? Who gave them top spot? Society's power structure they trying to keep in place, but English broke free in style and grace. When non-natives come together, they don't need no prescriptions. They can communicate with ease without fear of restrictions. For English today, it's clear to see, is well intelligible for you and for me. Fear not prescriptive standards. It's a language that bends. When used flexibly, borders it transcends. With each interaction, it develops and grows. A language for all, its flexibility shows. It's not about spelling or grammar that's correct. It's about understanding, making people connect. A language that's flexible, easy to adapt. The language of choice, a wave you can't stop. Every time it arises, unique in a way, unconfined by grammar Nazis, and yet it won't fail. So keep this in mind when you use this tongue. English as a lingua franca is for everyone. So thanks a lot for listening. If you're interested, there's a reference there and some links where you can get more resources for free. And if I could just use 10 more seconds, we're running a study where we're investigating students' perceptions of learning effectiveness online and offline. This takes around 17 minutes to complete. That's the link up there. It's a link for students. If you could share it out, we'll be very grateful. But otherwise, thanks again. I'm really loving the outpouring of reactions. It's much more so than in the morning, though. Then we also had a 4-digit number of participants, but I'm really loving this audience now being so energetic. So thanks, and happy to take comments, questions. Thank you.
Hello, Mikhail. Thank you very much. And yes, people are interacting a lot in the chat box and via the reactions. So we can see many emojis here. So amazing talk. And as you said, you built up on what Rhona started talking to us earlier. So many interesting insights and lots of technical information as well. So we can dig into this English as a lingua franca world. And yes, we have a few questions for you. So let me do it quickly here. Don't know if we have much time to go, but from Eduardo Osorio, some students always ask which is better, American or British English. And if they learn either, they will be able to understand an Indian or Australian speaker. What should be answered to these students, Mikhail?
Thanks. So the thing is that we always define accents by comparing them with what we know. So if I'm a, let's say, speaker of Spanish, and I was brought up in one area, then that accent will be the natural one for me and the neutral one for me, and then others will be different, or they will be marked, right? And the same with national varieties. You know, if you're brought up in the UK, then you'll immediately be able to pick up that someone is not from the UK, but importantly, even within just one country, you have so many sub-varieties that may often be not mutually intelligible, as we've seen examples of today. So I wouldn't say that there's one variety that is much more comprehensible than others. What research has shown times and times again is that very often it's the non-native speakers that are more intelligible than native speakers, primarily because a lot of native speakers use plenty of weak forms and other reductions that make the speech hard to reconstruct. Mm-hmm. So very often the students will actually be much better understood, and also not only by non-native speakers, but also by native speakers than other native speakers. So I'm not sure that we should be asking the question, you know, which native variant is the best. We should make our students aware of the fact that even native speakers, educated native speakers, have trouble comprehending one another. And then you can show them materials to make them aware of that. And then you can show them, for instance, videos of successful individuals who are successful in their careers or whatever goals they need the language for, when they're not native speakers of English, right? So the role models would be experts, but experts in their domain, not experts in terms of being native speakers of the language.
Interesting. So, well, trying to sum up, I would say that intelligibility is something we need to look into, but also raise awareness, right? Raise awareness that there are so many variants, and even sometimes inside one country or one territory, you're going to find for native speakers lots of different variants. So let's just keep an eye out for all these variants and try to maybe understand them and expand our knowledge of these different possibilities, right?
Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, Mikhail, thank you very much for this lovely talk. It was amazing. We've had many reactions. I think I need your, can you, yeah, I think you stopped sharing. So I'll start sharing my screen now, just to remind people at home that you guys are going to get a certificate of attendance, okay? So personalized certificates and virtual goodie bags via email if you are watching on Zoom. If you are watching on Facebook or LinkedIn, you can register for the other days, so you can also get your personalized certificate. So don't forget, go to macmillanenglish.com/DTF and subscribe right now, because there's still loads of many interesting talks and speakers to come. You cannot miss it, so we'll be waiting for you here. This is still only day 2. We have a lot going on, so stay tuned. Don't miss the next talk today, later today, and also the rest of the full program. Day 3 is coming up tomorrow, day 4 coming up too, and I know that you guys are going to love everything that we have in store for you, okay? So thank you again, Mikhail. Thank you, Rhona. Thank you, everybody, all the viewers who have spent your time and this morning, or depending on the time zones. Check out the time zones because there are 3 times each day for the talks, so we can manage to cater for audiences all over the world. After all, this is the Global Teachers Festival. So thank you all very much, speakers, audience, and see you all soon for our next amazing talks. All right? Bye-bye, everybody. Take care. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye, bye-bye.